In the previous lesson, we saw how we can get elements from our HTML page and utilize them within our JavaScript. So we also have some more options. So not every element has an ID. We can also pick up list items and so on. So let's do that within this lesson. I'll show you how you can pick up the list items. So list items, and this is going to be, looks the same, but there is a different method where we would pick up the elements via either the tag name. So we're going to pick it up via the tag name this time. So get. So we see that we've got some options here. Get element by ID. We can get element by name, and we've got get element by a given tag name. So get elements by tag name. And we see that this is pluralized because we know that with tags, there's a good possibility it's being used more than once. So this is going to get returned back as an array. So we'll see now that we're getting all the list items. And what I'm going to do first is we'll console log out all of those list items. So again, we can take a better look and see what's being returned here. So when we refresh it, we see we've got an HTML collection here. So we've got two list items, we've got a length here. And we know that once we've got this length, we can loop through them using a loop and output that content. So just like what we did down here, we can just simply loop through the different list items and we can output that content. So updating this, for instead of all, it's going to be list items, document. So actually we need to get rid of that because all we need is list items. So list items X, and now we need to be more specific with what we want to do with them. So maybe we want to just output that inner HTML. And let's just take a look and see what actually gets returned here. So save that and let's check it out within our browser. So when we refresh it, we see that we actually can return back both of those list items. So we've got home, we've got about, both listed out there. And this is how we can work with the different elements within our web page. So there's also classes. So I've got a class of clear here, and I'm going to just update some of these. So we've got some other items here that contain that same class. So I'm going to just create a div here, and it'll hold that same value that's contained within clear. So just space that out, and another div. So let's save that, and I'm just going to beautify that so it's more readable. And let's take a loop through, and instead of list items, we're going to do listing out the classes. So let's do variable class list and document. So we just have to access that document object, and this time let's do get. So we saw we had get element by ID, get element by name, and we're also now we're looking for get element by class name. So this one, it's actually not being listed here, but we can do get elements by class name. And here we need to specify, just as we did the list items, our class name, which is clear. And let's loop through those now. So we've got a class list there, and let's loop through that, and let's add that into the console there at the end. So now let's take a look and see what we're returning. So we do see that we're listing it out. It's actually listing it out as the HTML because it's including all of that spacing and so on. So maybe it's better to list it out as inner text. So make sure that that's uppercase because it is case sensitive there. So now we can list it out as another div, copyright, and we know that these are the contents of those classes. So a lot of different options to make your selection and find out all the different elements, make those selections, access those elements on your web page. And lastly, there's actually another way as well to select out different elements on the page. And this is using the query selector. So let's do another one here, and maybe we'll call it custom element or something like that. and we're going to do document. And this time we're going to use the query selector. So we've got query selector all or query selector. So query selector is going to return the first element that is the descendant that invokes. So it's only going to return back the first one that's going to match the criteria. And then in here, we need to just specify what we're looking for. So let's take a look at this and see what actually gets returned back here. And maybe we need to list out that inner text. So let's check this out in our browser. So what do you think is going to get returned back there? And we can't actually read the property of inner text. Let's take a look at what's actually being returned back there if we're actually picking up any of the elements. And we see that we're getting a null value that's being returned there. And the reason is that we're actually not being specific enough onto what we're looking for. So if we're looking for a class, we need to specify it as such. So we see that it's a div clear, or we could be even more specific and actually search for a div clear. So we have to be specific, just as we would with CSS and specifying returning back those elements. So query selector all, so this is going to return back a number of elements. So maybe I'll just put an S there at the end. And we're going to search for the class of clear and see what we get returned back now. So when I refresh it, I get back 2 nodes. I've got the div, I've got the footer. So now I would have to loop through them, just as what I did before, and then return back those values. So let's update this. So we're going to do X again, class list inner text. So make sure we don't have that spacing in there. And now let's check out and see what gets returned back in our console. So again, we get that we get the copyright. So both of those are getting returned back in the node list. And this is how we make all of our selections, picking out the different elements that now we want to utilize and have access to within our JavaScript. And this is a really important first step, because being able to identify the elements and bring them into your JavaScript is the first step in making them functional, interactive, being able to update them, and so on. So we could just as easily, just as we're console logging this out, we could say something like inner text equals changed or something like that, and you'll just see really how powerful this can be. So instead of actually outputting in our console, we can actually update the actual content on our web page. And now if I go to inspect that element, we see that the element has actually been changed. Even though if we go to the view source, we see that we'd still have our initial values there within the source, but when the browser renders it out, it hits the JavaScript, and the JavaScript interacts with the DOM and makes all of those updates. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at some really cool stuff that we can do with the DOM. So now we've seen that it's very powerful, and there's a lot we can do with it, and there is even more we can do with it. So that's all coming up in the next set of lessons.